Okay, so Mesopotamia is a word of Greek origin meaning the land between two rivers, used by the Greeks to describe some land between two rivers, namely Tigris and Euphrates, which both run southwards through what we now call Iraq. There were people living there since at least 6000 BCE, which is a lot of fucking time ago, and there's good reason for it. So, you might remember the last ice age, 20,000 years ago, give or take. After that ended, Earth started getting warmer, and people started trying new stuff, like agriculture. Yeah, I'm talking about agriculture, of course. Planting plants like wheat and barley, which is a whole lot easier than hunting for food. Now, agriculture was actually discovered many different times on Earth, but right now we're talking about the Middle East, right? So let's focus on that. Yeah, Mesopotamia was a big sort of development hub for agriculture. It wasn't the first place on Earth to do it, but it was probably the first to do agriculture on like a large societal scale. You've probably guessed why. It's because of the rivers. You idiot. Rivers Tigris and Euphrates are fucking dope, and there's two main reasons for that. First, irrigation. Southern Mesopotamia is pretty dry, but regular river floods make its land actually pretty good. Second, trade routes by water. You with me? So, the two reasons are planting and trading, which also happen to be important factors for the emergence of civilization. Which did emerge. From 6000 to 3000 BCE, a whole bunch of cities started popping up along the southern region of Mesopotamia, starting from Eridu and Ur, which are the oldest, and moving north. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what kind of people lived in these cities. Probably many different Semitic tribes, but also quite importantly, the Sumerians, which are the guys who give this region its name of Sumer in the future. That's because the common tongue throughout these cities was Sumerian, which is a language isolate written with ideograms in the cuneiform script. So it's kind of like Chinese or Japanese kanji, but instead of paper it's clay tablets. Note, we shouldn't just assume all the people living in these cities were Sumerian just because they spoke the language. As I said, it was a common tongue, and there were a lot of Semitic people in the same region as the Sumerians. It's just very hard to know the percentages of ethnicities from 8,000 years ago or something. The cities were likely composed by a weird mix of a lot of stuff. We also shouldn't assume these cities were united by some kind of central government or something like that, because that's downright false. They weren't. They were city-states, which means they were independent cities who did pretty much whatever the hell they wanted. Mostly. So now you have all these city-states sprout out through Sumer, right? And every century or so, you've got even more showing up. Remember, they shared the Sumerian language, and they also shared the culture, so they were pretty similar in how their societies worked, even if they weren't governed by the same kings. In fact, speaking of kings, their governors have been called multiple names, but we'll just say kings for simplicity. They were supposed to be these representatives of the gods and defenders of the people, and they played a big religious role. The kings and their family, or the royal court, were deeply associated with the religious temples and temple staff, and generally speaking, each city had at least one big temple dedicated to a specific god, to which the king was linked to. So the king of Uruk was always the representative of goddess Inanna, the king of Nippur was always the representative of god Enlil, etc. A lot of historians in the 20th century fell into the trap of believing this was a despotic society, where the king owned everything because he was god on earth, but that's just not true. Private property existed, normal people had their land, they had their jobs, society was already pretty complex. It's true the religious life and the temples were pretty central, but they weren't everything. For example, agriculture and trade were also very important. Remember when I mentioned those two earlier? Yeah, controlling the rivers in Mesopotamia was a really shitty process because they just flooded everywhere, so you needed a lot of fancy canal digging and just a lot of work. So that's another reason for the state and the king to be so important, because this is tough shit to really organize without a state and a king. And then trade, of course. There was a lot of stuff and people moving between these cities, and to other civilizations as well outside of Sumer. That was already a big part of life. You had pottery, jewelry, textiles going around, and of course metal as well, because, you know, we're in the period called the Bronze Age. And to get bronze, you need to merge tin and copper, and tin was not found in the region. You needed to trade to get it. Speaking of bronze, that was mostly used for weapons and war. Yeah, you had a lot of war. Like, the Sumerian cities knew they were bros, sort of, but they still fought a lot. They already had horses, carts, spears, axes, bowls, shields, leather armor, and other stuff. And they frequently had political disputes and conquered territory all over. For example, Lagash and Numa famously hated each other. Between 25 and 2400, King Eannatum of Lagash was duking it out with King Ush of Umma, because Umma had violated some kind of border treaty Kish had made for them. Mind you, Kish seems to be some kind of mediator city-state, which all the other cities respect in some way. Anyway, Eannatum won in the name of his patron god Ningirsu, and Lagash expanded into a proto-empire of sorts. It's hard to say how big it was, but an inscription claims Lagash ruled pretty much all of Sumer and a bit of Elam down there. This did not last very long though. As soon as Eannatum died, it pretty much fell apart, as is very common with empires in history. Regarding politics and war, we actually have a very interesting document about Mesopotamia entitled the Sumerian King List from the late 3rd millennium, which is this clay prism with cuneiform writing on it, which claims to name all the kings who ruled Mesopotamia in order. Now this list is very sus, if I do say so myself. First off, the first few kings are said to have absurdly long reigns, like from a few hundred years to 30,000 years, which is obviously the stuff of legend. Second, as I've already established, there isn't really an order of kings. That doesn't make any sense. There were multiple cities in Mesopotamia and each had their own dynasties. This king list kind of tries to create a narrative where power is passed from one city to another in a certain order, and at any given time there is always just one city which is controlling all of Sumer, which is not true at all. And fun fact, Eannatum isn't even on the list. You know, the guy who actually did control all of Sumer, supposedly anyways. But we can use this list to help us determine the years in which some of these kings ruled, which historians have already attempted to do with varying results. See, especially when you get to the times of Akkad, the list actually becomes pretty reliable. Wait, shit, I don't think I told you about Akkad himself. Surprise! Sudden empire. Many consider this to be the first great empire of history, in fact. Though that's very debatable. I mean, what even is an empire, right? So it's kind of like... The definition I like the most is an empire is a large range of land, people, ethnicities, and nations controlled by a single political entity, with a process of centralization that's maintained through some sort of force. Now that's a fucking mouthful, right? It's also kind of vague. Like, Eannatum kind of had a multi-ethnic empire when he conquered Elam, so I guess you could say he made an empire before the Akkadians? Maybe, but it was so short-lived that honestly it barely existed. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. You can also just call it an empire because it's big and fights all the time, which is very much the case for Akkad, which is big and fights all the time. Oh, my bad, by the way. I didn't even introduce you to Akkad. Let's go back in time a bit. So after Eannatum kicked the bucket, the wars went on for a bit, until back in maybe the mid-2300s, Lugol-Zagsi of Umma had established great conquests, defeating Lagash and Kish, and making another proto-empire from what was originally just an alliance with Ur and Uruk. Then, a Semitic people popped up from the middle of fucking nowhere and took Lugozaxi's empire. These guys were the Akkadians, one of the many Semitic people in the regions I spoke of before. They technically weren't inside of Sumer, they just arrived from the north, nobody knew them, and they took everything. So the Akkadians are Semitic, right? And the Akkadian language, unlike the Sumerian language, is not an isolate. It's closely related to Arabic and Hebrew, for example. So it is a different culture than the culture that dominates down in Sumer proper. Akkadians are technically outsiders, which does not necessarily mean they weren't already familiar with Sumerian culture. Akkadian language was also inscribed in clay tablets, much like the Sumerian language, and they shared some gods. We'll talk about the gods later. Point is, the Akkadians had always been kinda there, basking at the fringes of Sumerian civilization, but only now did they rise to prominence. Sargon the Great overthrew Lugozaxi in a war, took his territory to himself, and transferred the capital from Uruk to Akkad, a newly built city just north of Sumer. We don't know exactly where Akkad is, actually, because we haven't dug it up yet. And also, we don't know if it maybe always existed as a small settlement, or if Sargon built it from the ground up. It's complicated. Anyway, the Akkadians did military conquest, war, yada yada, biggest Mesopotamian empire in history until that point. So that's pretty much the story of how the Akkadian Empire came to be. Question number 1, who the fuck is Sargon? Because the only stories we really have about the guy are legends from over 1,000 years later, and you can probably guess legends from 1,000 years later do not count as scholarly sources. One of them claims Sargon was the son of a high priestess, an Entum, who conceived him in secret, because mind you, priestesses had to be celibate, so she put him in a basket and cast him down the river, which sounds a hell of a lot like the story of Moses. Anyways, as Sargon survived, became a gardener, and eventually the king somehow. Another legend tells the story of how he became a cupbearer to the king of Kish, and by the wishes of the gods, he took over his throne to make an empire. It's impossible for us to say whether either of these stories have any sliver of truth to them. In which case, question number 2, did Sargon even exist, actually? I mean, Sargon's name literally means king in Akkadian, so like, what tells us he wasn't just made up by the Akkadian dynasty, but like his grandson or something? Historians have debated a lot over this subject, and their answer right now is So, Sargon defeated Lugozaxi, annexed the entirety of Sumer, and built a centralized state that would go on to last through 7 kings and pretty much 200 years. Later texts give the impression that the Akkadian Empire was very short-lived and unstable, but that's not true from what we can tell. It maintained itself by giving power to the local elites of each city, so the royal families, while also managing the whole thing with people from the imperial family at Akkad. So for example, Akkad started the tradition of sending royal daughters to become priestesses in Ur, which is something that will last for quite a bit, as we'll see later. There was a lot of war against the surrounding nations and peoples, expansionism. The army became huge by recruiting outsiders like the Amorites and the Guccians. There was a ton of mixing between Sumerian and Semitic culture, huge trading networks that went as far as India, and eventually Naran Sin, who was Sargon's grandson, could even call himself King of the Four Corners. In this case, the four corners of the world that they knew. Of course, the world is way bigger than just Mesopotamia, but they didn't know that yet. It cannot be overstated how colossally important the Akkadian Empire was for Mesopotamia. Sargon is the exemplary, legendary king who the Babylonians and the Assyrians will look back on for centuries to come, as a prime example of what it means to be a great political leader. The Akkadian Empire will grow to be as mystical and great to the future Mesopotamians as the Roman Empire is to us right now. As any empire, of course, Akkad would eventually fall. Later Mesopotamian texts attribute the fall of the empire to Nut-un-Sin for some reason, which is straight up wrong, and a lot of them also talk about the invasions of the Guchins, who were supposedly responsible for destroying the capital as some kind of divine punishment from the god Enlil, because Nut-un-Sin had allegedly enraged Enlil. Truth is, Akkad's decline was very slow. It lost territory bit by bit, with more and more cities establishing independence, until it was just a single city again. And then, indeed, the Guchins took over for a bit. Akkad disappeared, and we barely know anything from there, because there wasn't much documentation left. This period of Guchin rule in Mesopotamia is sometimes known as a dark age of Sumero-Akkadian culture. No, wait, erase that. Who the hell wrote this? Okay, a lot of historians like to call the following period the Sumerian Renaissance of Mesopotamia because it comes after the Dark Ages and it revitalizes Sumerian culture, which was lost in all of that Guchin mess. That's the general idea. But I'm here to tell you that this is fucking wrong. See, the Guchins were a group of pastoralists living at the Zagros Mountains, and they spoke the Guchin language, and they did occupy Sumer and Akkad throughout the Dark Ages. That's until this guy named Utuhengal from Uruk apparently defeated the Guchins, yeeted them from Sumer, and then one of his governors, Ur-Nammu, became king of a new dynasty at Ur. This is known from the king list as the Third Dynasty of Ur, or just Ur-3 for short. And from there, he made another empire, or a sort of empire. So the thing is, some of the texts we have from this time were written in Sumerian, and by some I mean a lot of them. So there's this misconception that Ur-3 was trying to bring back the old Sumerian culture from the times of the city-states, but in reality, quite the opposite. It was trying to bring back Akkadian culture. These new kings of Ur saw themselves as the heirs to Sargon's empire, the ones who were supposed to bring back civilization from whatever ashes the Guchins had left behind. Akkad was the role model to Ur-3, not Sumer, which is why they made an empire. True and fair, they wrote a lot of administrative documents in Sumerian, but the reality is most of the people of Mesopotamia by this time only spoke Akkadian on a daily basis. You know how in the Middle Ages, Latin was used by the Catholic Church and by literally no one else because nobody spoke it? Yeah, it's kind of like that. Sumerian is kind of like Latin. Ur-3, as the self-proclaimed direct successor to Akkad, was a very complicated state, and we know a lot more about it because it provides ample documentation. It divided the empire into many provinces for ease of administration, oversaw the construction of new sanctuaries in many Sumerian cities, like this cool-ass ziggurat, and produced a lot of literature that would be carried on to the later Mesopotamian periods. It also sedimented the idea of the king as a nearly divine being, which is something that was started by Nut-un-Sin in the Akkadian Empire, and will be very important to Assyria especially. But we'll talk about that later. We unfortunately know rather little about the proper history of Ur-3, like the battles it fought. It definitely fought a lot, we know that. Ur-Nammu, for example, was killed fighting the Guchins, and we do have vague ideas about the many wars waged against the Amorites. Otherwise though, Ur-3 seemed like a pretty rad place to live in. Not for long. Hunger filled the city like water it would not cease. This hunger contorts people's faces, it twists their muscles. Its people are as if surrounded by water, they gasp for breath. Its king breathed heavily in his palace all alone. Its people dropped their weapons hit the ground, they struck their necks with their hands and cried. How long until we are finished off by this calamity? Or, inside it there is death, outside it there is death. Holding together an empire this complicated is actually sort of hard, as Akkad already proved, so it didn't last much. Economic crisis caused immense social problems in the empire, mostly famine, and Ur-3's fragility allowed many different groups, like those damn Amorites and the Elamites to the east to topple it fully. Shortly after the ultimate fall war, the Sumerian language and Sumerian culture as a whole would slowly fade into obscurity, effectively merging into the many Semitic cultures of the region. Mesopotamia now entered a new phase of its long history. While the first phase of Mesopotamia was defined by the relationship between Sumer and Akkad, the second phase is now entirely Akkadian in nature and will come to be defined primarily by the nations of Assyria and Babylonia. Small diversion to talk about Mesopotamian culture. This video is mostly political history, as you've probably already noticed, but I think it's important to mention some aspects of Mesopotamian culture, and so let's start with religion. I've briefly gone over this in the previous segments, but religion was very central in Mesopotamia. It wasn't everything, but it was central. And not in the sense we view religion today as something separate from personal life. No, participating in cults to the gods was seen as just a normal fact of daily life. In Mesopotamia, that was something everyone did daily, and even the most militaristic kings had to pay tribute to the gods and take personal part in these cultic tasks. Religion was also important for women in Mesopotamia, because women, they can't be politicians, they're fucking stupid. Don't take that out of context. In all seriousness, although Mesopotamian women did have many legal rights, they still had it pretty hard. They were severely objectified. Marriages were mostly a transaction kind of deal, where the father delivered his daughter to the husband. Creepy stuff. Not to mention polygamy was a thing. Kings especially could have a shit ton of wives who were all more or less his property. But going back to my original point, religion was the big field in which Mesopotamian women could have some amount of power. Rich women, especially the daughters of kings, could often become priestesses, which were very important to the religious sphere, even if not politically influential. And this is a tradition that will come and go many times throughout Mesopotamian history. Mesopotamian religion is polytheistic, and Mesopotamians were very accepting of non-Mesopotamian gods, though they did think their gods were better overall. As I've already mentioned, it was a tradition for each city to be associated to a specific god. There are many Mesopotamian gods, but the stories about them are very loose and scattered, and it can be difficult to get a clear picture of the entire pantheon. Especially true when some of the gods have different names depending on whether you're talking about them in Sumerian or in Akkadian. Yeah, Sumerian and Akkadian culture shared a lot of the gods. It's very confusing. Some of the more prominent gods are Ea, Sumerian Enki, god of water and knowledge and patron of Eridu; Eliu, Sumerian Enlil, god of wind and earth and patron of the poor, later associated with the Akkadian Ashur; Marduk, god of the city of Babylon, who would later rise as king of the gods; Shamash, Sumerian Utu, god of the sun and mostly worshipped at Separ and Larsa; and Ishtar, Sumerian Inanna, goddess of love and war, patroness of Uruk, and significant influence on later goddesses like the Phoenician Astarte and the Greek Aphrodite. The exact stories about these gods are also shrouded in darkness. Some of the more well-known mythological or semi-mythological tales we've recovered are the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ishtar's descent into the underworld, and Enuma Elish, which is the most complete creation myth we have from Mesopotamia. Enuma Elish tells the story of how Marduk slew Tiamat, goddess of the sea, and then split her corpse in two to make the sky and the earth, respectively. And, on the topic of creation myths, I guess I can also mention Genesis, which deals more of the creation of humankind and the eventual inescapable flood that destroys it almost entirely. A flood very akin to that of the Bible, which means it was likely its inspiration. The same story pops up in the aforementioned Epic of Gilgamesh, by the way. All of these are from either the Ur-3 period or the period shortly after. There's very little literature remaining from earlier than that. What else? I've already talked about the many scientific advances of Sumer and Akkad, like writing, the control of the rivers. They were awesome at bronze working, of course. I guess I could mention slavery. Mesopotamian society was not sustained by slavery. Most workers in Mesopotamia were free, but yes, slaves existed. They were mostly criminals or prisoners of war who were seen as property to be used, bought, or sold. very similar to Greece or Rome, if you're familiar. I don't think I need to talk about Mesopotamian art in specific. I've already shown you a lot of clay tablets and statuettes, and in between each section, I've been showing some snippets of some songs from Peter Pringle and the Lyre Ensemble. Those are actual Mesopotamian poems sung in Sumerian or Akkadian, though of course the people who recorded them had to make up the rhythm to go with the lyrics. Check them out, they've got some super great stuff. Something that I haven't mentioned yet is the laws. Mesopotamia did have laws. I'm not gonna go too deep into them because I think it's fucking boring, but well, you'll see when we get to Hammurabi. Speaking of which, enough of this bullshit. Kick it. Getting back on track now. Last we left, Ur-Tree had just collapsed thanks to socio-economical crisis and to getting railed by the Amorites and the Elamites. Once more, Mesopotamia reverted to the scheme of independent city-states warring against each other, trying to see who held more land and power. Except now we have a lot of newcomers. Up in the north, we're seeing a shit ton of new city-states pop up, and there has been a considerable influx of Amorites in Mesopotamia as a whole. The Amorites were Semitic pastoralists from the west, and ever since before Ur-Tree, they've been slowly integrating themselves into Akkadian culture and society. For example, remember Mari? Yeah, I didn't think so, but Mari has been there for a long time, I just forgot to mention it. It's been a pretty important city in Upper Mesopotamia, and it was conquered by Anatum, the Akkadians, and even Ur-Tree. Right now, it's independent again, and it's pretty influential in the region. However, it's being controlled by the Lim dynasty, which is made up of Amorites. Very common phenomenon starting from now on. A lot of the cities that used to be controlled by either Sumerians or Akkadians fall into Amorite hands because they're just everywhere at this point. We're gonna keep seeing that. But enough Mari. Let's focus on the main players that I mentioned, right? Ashur is a city in the northern part of Mesopotamia, to the west of the Tigris River. It sits in a region of frequent rainfall which reduces its dependency on rivers. It shares its name with the god Ashur, which is the city's patron deity. Ashur is old, possibly older than the Akkadian Empire, much like Mari. Also much like Mari, Ashur was a subject of Akkad, a subject of Ur-Tree, and people there mostly spoke Akkadian, though more specifically Assyrian, which is a dialect of Akkadian. But in the 1800s BCE, the Amorites struck. Shamshi-Adad usurped the throne and installed his own dynasty in Ashur. The city had already been rising in prominence by this time, and it was mostly through trade. Ashur's position in the trade networks was very strategic, connecting Anatolia to southern Mesopotamia and helping out in the very lucrative tin trade that was going on. Ashur probably got very rich from this, so rich that we have a lot of documents about it buying silver and gold and whatever. In fact, it was so rich that before Shamshi-Adad took the throne, it was controlled less by the king and more by an assembly of merchant families. Of course, this economic power allowed Ashur to establish many colonies in Anatolia, like the Karuns, in Kanesh, and many other non-Assyrian cities, be them Hattian, Hurrian, or whatever other group roamed the region. Eventually, Ashur even conquered some space close to home, like Mari, Nineveh, and Shabbat-Enlil. This process would slowly increase the military might of the king, which I'm sure will have no future ramifications whatsoever for Ashur. For now, it's interesting to touch on the idea Ashur had about vice-regents. Remember how the kings of Akkad and Ur-Tree said they were nearly divine beings working for the gods? Yeah, we see something similar here in Ashur. The true king of Ashur was always said to be the god Ashur, while the human kings who governed in his place were seen as his vice-regents, merely representing him down on earth. This will also not have any consequences, so to speak of, don't worry about it. So while Ashur keeps expanding its commercial empire up there in the north, let's move on to Babylon. Southern Mesopotamia was very chaotic after Ur-Tree fell. The king Ishbiaha from Isin and his successors tried to be the heirs to the throne, in a sense, rebuilding the destruction wrought by the Elamites. These were the very last kings of the Sumerian king list. And although Isin did hold up for some time, the Amorite dynasty at Larsa eventually broke off and defeated Isin. Larsa effectively replaced Isin, but it had very little territory in its short history. As all this shit was going down, Babylon was just sitting there silently, waiting and watching. It's about as old as Ashur, though it was originally constructed as a simple sanctuary to the god Marduk. Also like Ashur, Babylon speaks Akkadian, though it was a different dialect. And also, like Ashur, Babylon is currently being controlled by an Amorite dynasty. Unlike Ashur though, Babylon is small and pretty weak when compared to Larsa, for example. Or at least it was small and weak until Hammurabi came about. You've probably heard of him. He wrote the first law code of the world or something like that, the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi talks about a lot of stuff. It's very interesting, like marriage, slavery, the punishments for crimes, and it is indeed one of the oldest legal codes we can still read today. It is actually not the oldest law code though. That goes to Ur-Nammu's law code from Ur-Tree, which I haven't talked about. But that's not what matters right now though. Hammurabi was way more than just some lawmaker contrary to popular belief. He started off small when he became king. Babylon mostly fought as a vassal state to the big guys like Larsa or Ashur, but in 1763 he struck gold. Hammurabi defeated Larsa and with his newfound territory and power went on to devour Mari, Eshnunna, and even Ashur. This is sometimes called the Old Babylonian Empire. You might want to get a good look at it because it will not last long. Not at this size, at least. After Hammurabi died, his successors had a really hard time maintaining all this territory, and though they did manage to pull through for almost 3 centuries, by the end of that, Babylon was turning into a shell of its former self, until it was finally ransacked by the Hittites in 1595. Another one bites the dust. Crazy shit, right? It seems like empires keep coming and going, and everyone dies, and there's never a happy ending. That's Mesopotamia for you. This place is pure chaos through all of its history. It's the meeting point of 3 fucking continents, and with how rich and complex it is, you might as well call it the center of the world in a sense. On this side of the globe at least, and on this specific point in time. Don't forget, when we started the video talking about those city-states and their small-scale wars, it was around 3000 BC, and now it's fucking 1595 BC. That's 1400 years, which is a lot of time for stuff to happen. And there's still a lot of stuff that's about to happen. Honestly, I'm kind of running out of air here. Imagine talking for 1400 years, Jesus. Let's change things up a bit. We've talked about Mesopotamia enough, I'm fucking tired. So let's zoom out a bit and see how the world looks right now. Oh yeah. Yeah, okay, I'll be right back. You guys keep looking at that map. Oh shit, oh fuck, my water. Never mind that. I guess I need to introduce you to at least some of these guys. This video isn't about them, so I'll try to keep it short. That right there is Egypt, which I've already mentioned, which reached its 18th dynasty in 1550. It's been a pretty big power alongside Mesopotamia, and it just transitioned into the New Kingdom, which is way more militaristic and will come into conflict with other countries pretty soon. That's Elam. We don't know a lot about Elam, but it's always been very close to Sumer and Akkad, even if it speaks its own language. Its main city was Susa, and right now Elam's about to enter its middle period, where it will be governed by kings from Anshan, way down there. Multiple times through Mesopotamian history, Elam has been a political enemy to Mesopotamian civilizations. Lagash and Ur-Tree especially come to mind, and this ain't getting any different going forward, as we'll see. So remember the Hurrians? They've also been here since forever. They speak Hurrian, they've had several kingdoms throughout the years, and Mitanni is by far the most powerful and influential, especially now. However, Mitanni is still a sort of vassal state to someone bigger. The Hittite Empire, otherwise known as Hatti. The Hittites are some weird guys from Anatolia who speak an Indo-European language, so pretty different from the Semitic languages. But shortly after the collapse of those Assyrian trading colonies, the Hittites centralized Anatolia under a single kingdom at Hattusa, their capital, and now they're armed and dangerous. Remember, these are the guys who destroyed Babylon just now, they're pretty strong. Okay, so Now that we have a bit more context, let's step back into Mesopotamia. I said Ashur and Babylon would be the most important pieces of the second Mesopotamian phase, so how are they doing right now? Well, first off, you might have noticed this little guy down here, the Sealand Dynasty. If you're really good with geography, you maybe also noticed that the southern coast of Mesopotamia has looked kind of off for the whole video, including now. That's on purpose. If you didn't know, the Persian Gulf has actually been getting smaller over the last few thousand years. In other words, back in the Bronze Age, the Persian Gulf was larger, and the shoreline down here looked way different as a result. This is because the two rivers are constantly depositing silt at the end of their courses, so the rivers are literally building new land, constantly. And by the Middle Bronze Age, this had made enough of a difference that an entire new kingdom can be established down here, breaking off from the old Babylonian Empire and just doing its own thing. That being said, yeah, the New Babylonia conquered it circa 1475, which, oh yeah, to make things easier to talk about, I will now be referring to northern Mesopotamia as Assyria, the region of Ashur, and to southern Mesopotamia as Babylonia, including both Sumer and Akkad, the region of Babylon. This is the terminology that's most commonly used from this period forward, where these two nations are the dominant forces in Mesopotamia as a whole. So after Hammurabi took Ashur, Ashur lost a considerable amount of power and reverted back to being a small, unimportant city, heavily influenced by the political power of Mitanni in the north. Eventually though, the situation stabilized and a new dynasty was established by Adasi. The first decades of the Adaside dynasty are very obscure, but fast forward 300 years and you'll see Mitanni has actually conquered Ashur. But surprise, the Hittite Empire attacks Mitanni, which allows Ashur to get its independence in the confusion. A few years later, around 1363, Ashur-Balid ascends to the throne. This kickstarts what is known as the Middle-Assyrian Empire, in which the land of Assyria recovers its lost influence and becomes an international power once more. Half a century later, Adad-nirari would go on to pay Mitanni back by beating the shit out of it and conquering it. By this point, Assyria became a great ally to Egypt and a great enemy to the Hittites. Fun anecdote, Adad-nirari sent a letter to Muwatalli, the Hittite king, asking permission to visit Hatti. In said letter, he called Muwatalli his brother. This was a common practice in diplomacy at the time. When you consider yourself an equal and an ally to a neighboring king, you could call him your brother. So Adad-nirari was trying to stay friendly with the Hittites with this letter. Muwatalli's reply was, quote, "Why should I write to you about brotherhood? You and I, were we perhaps born of the same mother or father?" End quote. Meanwhile, Babylonia was as usual. The Hittite Empire had done a fucking number on Babylon and destroyed the Amorite dynasty, which allowed yet another pastoralist group to head straight into Babylon. This time, it was the Kassites, who came maybe from the Zagros Mountains, setting up a new dynasty that would last for like 500 years, long ass time. Unfortunately, not much is known about Kassite Babylonia, but it was an international power like Assyria. It was also an ally of Egypt and had special interests in guarding the commercial routes leading out into Iran, which often caused it to go to war with Elam and Assyria. For example, in the 1200s, Kashtiliash IV of Babylonia saw that Assyria was pretty preoccupied with the Hittites and took the opportunity to break a peace treaty and capture some territory they had lost to Assyria. The Assyrian king, Tukulti-Ninurta, reacted by beating Kashtiliash into a pulp and bringing him in chains to Ashur, which allowed Assyria to control Babylonia for the next 3 decades. Holy shit, Elam reacted, watching by the side. Quick, take the Tigris! But then Adad-Shumausur of Babylonia turned the tables and captured the new king of Assyria and freed Babylonia so it could go back to fighting Elam in peace. Shit was crazy. This is actually how the Kassite dynasty ended, by the way. Constant political attrition with Assyria and Elam eventually destabilized it, and a new dynasty had to be established at Isin, and chaos ensued for quite a bit. But let's focus on this part later. Thanks to all of this international conflict, Assyria was getting increasingly militaristic, as you might expect. It had gone from a small city controlled by some rich families to a warmongering empire led by its many aristocratic generals, who were all subservient to the king, naturally. It made a habit out of kicking everyone's ass, including the Hittites, which were pretty powerful. Though Assyria wasn't invincible, at least not yet. By the reign of Tiglath-Pileser in 1114, the incursions of the Arameans were starting to take their toll in Mesopotamia as a whole, and Assyria was losing ground. So was post-Kassite Babylonia, in fact. Now you might be wondering, who are the Arameans, my guy? Surely they aren't yet another pastoralist group that showed up out of thin air just to fuck things up, right? Well... So, quick rundown on the Arameans. They weren't a single group of people, they were a lot of different groups that just happened to speak the same language, Aramaic, which is Semitic like Akkadian, except it will come to use a variation of the Phoenician alphabet, so it's way easier to write than whatever the fuck this is. The Arameans show up in Mesopotamia by the end of Middle Assyria and Kassite Babylonia, and they're here to stay. Aramean groups consisted mostly of pastoralists, but they did create some independent states, especially around Assyria. And Phoenicia, down here. Yeah, the guys who made the Phoenician alphabet, which the Arameans eventually used. But anyways, the Arameans could prove to be a bit of a pain in the ass for both Assyria and Babylonia. They were both consistently raided by Aramean tribes, and this greatly contributed to much political instability in the end of the second millennium. It wasn't all bad though. Assyria actually started to recruit some Arameans into their armies, and Babylonia, though unstable, did manage to survive them. Also, you know how Akkadian was a really widely spoken language? Like, so widely spoken that even Egypt and Hatti used it as their lingua franca? Well, with Aramaic in town, this will start to change. Aramaic is just easier to learn and write, so it becomes a pretty important language in Mesopotamia from now on, and it will eventually replace Akkadian, just like Akkadian replaced Sumerian. We're not quite there though. For now, let's go back to the Assyrian Empire. Assyria most certainly wasn't happy with losing so much territory over north to the Arameans. That's why in 934, Ashur and II started campaigning over there, to take back all those commercial routes linking to Anatolia we mentioned before. He also had to fight the Arameans in the west, and constantly defend the Zagros, which remember were very important for the trade routes with Iran to the east. His son, Adasides II, tried to conquer Babylonia, but this ended up in a tie, for now. He did secure a lot of land around the northern borders, however. Then the son of this guy, Tukulti-Ninurta II, annexed the Aramean state of Bit-Zamani and secured Assyria's path to Anatolia. The Hittite Empire was long gone by this time. The closest descendants to it here in the south were the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, one of the largest of which was Karshemish. These smallish kingdoms weren't nearly as influential as Hatti, of course. But Anatolia still gave Assyria access to many riches and soldiers. It's important to keep in mind that as these many foreign kings were conquered by Assyria, they were frequently turned into provincial governors. So they actually remained kings of their respective nations. The only difference was that now they had to serve the Assyrian king, be it by paying him in gold or giving out soldiers to his army. And this is one of the central pieces of Assyrian imperialism. It's what effectively allows Assyria to grow into an unstoppable war machine. Every new piece of land it acquired only made it more and more powerful as its armies grew larger and larger. Adding foreign combatants to one's ranks isn't anything new. Mesopotamian states have been doing that since like Akkad, but Assyria dials this up to 11. By the reign of Ashur and II in 883, the central parts of the Neo-Assyrian Empire had already been consolidated, and the king just had to focus on pacifying the northern and southern reaches of the empire and making sure that everything was running smoothly. With all the riches Assyria had amassed, this king was bold enough to build a new Assyrian capital by renovating the abandoned city of KUHRT. Meanwhile, in the aforementioned northern reaches, specifically the Armenian highlands, the mysterious kingdom of Urartu was established, an upcoming new powerful rival to Assyria. As per usual, we know next to nothing about it, but Urartu did speak a language related to the Hurrian language, and it would prove to be one of the main deterrents to Assyrian expansionism, though not forever, as we'll still get to see. Note, I did just call this political period of Assyria the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The change from Middle Empire to New Empire happened a few years earlier in 911, but you can tell not much has changed, right? The dynasty is still the Adaside dynasty from the Middle Assyrian period, and the Neo-Assyrian kings see themselves as direct heirs to those guys, which is why they wanted to conquer Upper Mesopotamia in the first place. Unlike what happens all the time in Babylonia, we don't see any major shifts in population or government here in Assyria. It's more so a shift in how the Assyrian state behaves and operates, even if gradual and not so noticeable at first. By now, we're already past the Iron Age, meaning humans have learned to make weapons out of iron, and iron weapons have almost fully replaced bronze weapons in war. Bronze is hard to get. Remember, you need to trade tin with faraway nations, so only powerful kingdoms had large-scale access to bronze. But iron is easy. It's easy to find, easy to forge with, and that means literally everyone has iron weapons. Even a lot of those small pastoralist tribes that didn't used to be that dangerous. Now they are. What this means is, post-Bronze Age, antiquity is a fucking bloodbath, with everyone waging war against everyone else. If Assyria wanted to survive as the center of the world, it had to become something larger. An aggressive, relentless, gargantuan empire. So you could say this militarization was the natural course of events, in a way. But back to the empire. Following the change in capital, Shalmaneser III brought war against the Assyrian states to the north, annexing Bitadini. But by now something weird was happening down at Babylonia. Assyria and Babylonia were allies at this time, so Shalmaneser went down there to see what was up. Turns out some groups of Chaldeans, also Semitic newcomers but not to be confused with the Arameans, were stirring up some trouble and trying to take the throne. You know, the usual. So he dealt with that and also killed some Arameans on the way. He didn't destroy the Chaldeans, but they were held at bay for now, and they will show up again. The following king, Shamshi-Adad V, beat the shit out of Babylonia for no apparent reason, and the follow-up to that was Adad-Nirari III, whose mom was Shemuramat, otherwise known in the Bible as Semiramis, the Queen of Assyria. A lot of the lore encircling Shemuramat paints her as a legendary figure of badassery, one of the few if not the only woman in Mesopotamia to attain such a big position of power, the Queen. In truth though, she just seemed to govern alongside her son, maybe as an advisor. She might have had a big hand in securing her son's right to the throne after the death of her husband, but we don't have a lot of sources to work with. She probably wasn't as powerful as the title Queen of Assyria would lead you to believe. What? Oh look, it's the Chaldeans again? It's 731, and they took the throne of Babylon for themselves. Now what that means is the current king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser III, will invade Babylon, beat the shit out of Chaldeans, and become the king of Babylonia. That's right. Now the Assyrian king and the Babylonian king are the same fucking person. Take that, liberals. It's really too bad Tiglath-Pileser's son is killed in a violent coup by his half-brother Sargon II, not to be confused with Sargon of Akkad or Sargon I. Anyway, Sargon II installs what is known as the Sargonian dynasty of Assyria, but really, stuff stayed pretty much the same. Well, except now Assyria was shook from the transition of power, and shit was going down fast and hard. Sargon had to campaign in the north to fight against Hamath, and in the south he got his ass handed to him by Marduk-apla-iddina II of Bit Yakin, some Chaldean asshole who actually took Babylonia back. So Sargon fought back, reconquered Babylonia after 12 years of attrition, and sent Marduk running off to Elam. This victory was celebrated with the construction of yet another new capital at Dur-Shahukin. Then Sargon died in battle in Anatolia. The two following kings were able to sort out the instability in Babylonia and change the capital of the empire to Nineveh while they're at it, which is another important city. But they had to face a new challenger now. Remember how Egypt was an ally of Assyria way back in the Middle Period? Yeah, that changed. Now the Egyptian army was supporting many states in the north to rebel against Assyria, and this meant they had to go to war. Esarhaddon actually died in this conflict in 669, but his son Ashur-Banipal finished what he started. Yup, Egypt, straight up conquered by Assyria. Didn't last long. Ashur-Banipal couldn't hold it, but at least Egypt was no longer a major problem to Assyria. Also, Elam was destroyed, like, mercilessly. Not entirely, but this massive extension of the borders tends to paint Ashurbanipal as a ruthless, violent ruler. Regardless of how true that picture is, the Assyrian Empire is in fact huge now, and the Assyrian king is absurdly powerful. In ancient times, the Assyrian king was counterbalanced by families of powerful merchants. Later, he was counterbalanced by the nobles who became his generals. But now the king is the central figure of the biggest and most powerful state in history, unquestionable, unchallengeable, bested only by the god Ashur. You could say that Assyria was now a type of absolute monarchy like France would be in the far future. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is often painted as a super violent and barbaric army that destroys everything in its path, and that is rather exaggerated. But you can see where that image comes from, can't you? By this point, Assyria was completely geared to be, above all else, a war machine. War was seen as a divine commandment which the king was obliged to respond to appropriately. A way of life even. Now, this video has an ending. Mesopotamia has an ending. So you're probably looking at this big ass empire and thinking, what the fuck is gonna happen to take this bitch down? And fair. Let's rewind again. We need to take a closer look at Babylonia. So, a lot of the history we know from Assyria at this time comes from the royal inscriptions dedicated to the kings, which exalted their military campaigns and resounding victories in conquering the entire fucking world. Babylonia also sees plenty of royal inscriptions in its time, but they're mostly dedicated to all the cool buildings their kings built rather than military feats. For that reason, we know a lot less about the wars Babylonia fought, and much more about its bountiful construction work, which paints this image of Babylonia as a nation of majestic architecture and nothing else. It certainly did have majestic architecture, plenty of it, both new and old, but that's not all there was to it. It's important to point out that Babylonia was seen for most of Mesopotamian history as a cultural center to Mesopotamia. Remember, it encompasses both the regions of Sumer and Akkad, making it hold some of the oldest cities in the region, many of which were still standing at the time. It was also seen as a pretty big political force in general, as we've already discussed in the periods of Hammurabi, the Kassites, and the Chaldeans. The time between the fall of the Kassites and Assyria's conquest of Babylonia has little to no documentation. By this time, we know a much weaker Babylonia was having to deal with three main Chaldean tribes on its frontiers: Bitakuhi, Bitamukani, and Bityakin, not to mention the small Aramean tribes which were everywhere. It remained relatively friendly with the growing power of Assyria, but then the Chaldeans attacked. I've already gone over this in the previous section. Chaldean rulers attempted to take the Babylonian throne many different times, and in one of these cases, Shamshi-Adad V saw himself forced to subdue Babylonia. As we know, that wasn't the end of it, and the constant Chaldean threat led Tiglath-Pileser III to make himself king of Assyria and Babylonia in the following century. So for the next 100 years, Babylonia will be controlled either directly by the Assyrian king or by an Assyrian nominee, and any revolts in the region, be them Chaldean, Elamite, or even Babylonian, were severely repressed. Remember Marduk-apla-iddina of Bityakin? This guy was fucking relentless. He tried to seize back the Babylonian throne twice! First he was beat by Sargon II and sent to Elam, then he came back to fight Sennacherib and lost at Kish, then he returned again shortly after and distracted Assyria as Elam took Babylon for itself. It took destroying Babylon again to put down these revolts for good. Don't worry, they rebuilt Babylon. Again. 50 years later, Babylonia was under the government of Shamash-shum-ukin, an Assyrian nominee. He was Ashurbanipal's brother, who had been appointed by their father to govern Babylonia, but he ended up rebelling against Ashurbanipal with the help of Chaldeans, Arameans, Arabs, and Elamites, and Babylon had to be ransacked once more. As you can see, it wasn't easy at all to keep Babylonia in check. It was a constant threat for Assyria, it was a fucking time bomb with all the different forces interested in it. Only really a matter of time before it finally broke free of Assyria and took its place as the dominant Mesopotamian force. And that's about to happen. After getting rid of his brother, Ashurbanipal appointed Kandalanu to govern Babylonia in his place, and after Kandalanu died, Babylonia entered considerable political turmoil, which is unfortunately very muddy for us. But this ended in 626 with the ascension of Nabopolassar. a general who'd been appointed by Assyria but is about to become a traitor to it. His heritage is unclear. He could have been Chaldean, and his dynasty is commonly referred to as Chaldean. We don't know for sure, but let's go with that. Take it with a grain of salt. Anyways, Nabopolassar was different from the previous Babylonian rebels in that he had considerable outside military support by the Medes. Newcomers from Iran who were very eager to escape Assyrian lordship and make an empire of their own, and who surely would never try to take Babylonia in the future. Anyways, with their help, Nabopolassar was able to conquer important cities like Ashur, Kalhu, Nineveh, and finally Haran, which was the last capital of Assyria, effectively inheriting Assyria's lands and making Babylonia great again, and turning it into the Neo-Babylonian Empire, as we commonly call it. Egypt was no longer held by Assyria at this point, but it was still Assyria's ally, and it did try to fight back against Babylonia. But in the Battle of Carchemish, Egypt was beaten by Nebuchadnezzar II, the son of Nabopolassar. They didn't actually conquer Egypt. Egypt was still free for now. Nebuchadnezzar would become the king and go on to fight a lot in Syria, taking Jerusalem, Tyre, and other Levantine states. He used the nation's riches to rebuild many of the old cities in Sumer and Akkad, and held a very powerful state, and also quite stable even amidst all the chaos, much like Assyria had been. Nebuchadnezzar's son was assassinated by his own brother-in-law after reigning for just 2 years. This guy, in turn, reigned for 3 years before also dying, and his infant son was deposed and murdered after a month. This is obviously a huge mess, but the empire remained intact. And finally, in 556, Nabonidus, who was maybe the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, usurped the throne to put everything back into place. And for 17 years, he actually managed. I've already mentioned Babylonia effectively inherited Assyria at this point in time, and as far as we can tell, the same is true for much of its economics, provinces, political organization, etc. Just like the Assyrian king, the Babylonian king was very militaristic and powerful, maybe not as much, but similarly. Furthermore, Babylonia was demonstrably very rich, even hiring mercenaries from as far as Greece and with marvelous construction work. You've heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, right? Yeah. Nebuchadnezzar supposedly built those, and although we've never found them, and even if they did exist, there's some proof that they were actually Assyrian and not Babylonian, the legends go to show how marked this aspect was in culture at the time. The Babylonians were the guys with the cool buildings and amazing cities. That's what everyone thought. They were known for that. But now is when we get to the sad part. Remember the Medians? No. They're not gonna conquer Babylonia. That'd be stupid. They're besties. But, this happened. And then this happened. Yeah. This is Mesopotamia's final nail in the coffin, and its almost total loss of independence for the following millennia. Mesopotamia will retain its importance, but its unique culture will slowly fade out. The Akkadian language will be completely replaced by Aramaic, and, as you know, modern Iraq is much more Islamic in culture than properly Mesopotamian. In other words, from this point onwards, Mesopotamia as it was is effectively dead. And that's the entirety of Mesopotamia. So, thanks for watching. Holy shit, did it take a while for this video to get done. So, background, I woke up one day and decided I'd make this video, and here it is. I don't know if it was worth it, but at least it's done. You can see the sources on the screen there, so check them out if you're interested. This video is honestly very simplified. Mesopotamia is a really messy region for literally all of its history, so go read if you thought this was insufficient, because it was. It was insufficient. It's not that much information. Trivia. Mesopotamian culture still persists to this day. These people here are modern-day Assyrians, currently living all over the Middle East. They're a relatively small group, they no longer speak Akkadian, and they've actually been Christianized. Which is in itself very interesting, because the Middle East is predominantly Islamic nowadays. But that's a story for some other time. I might make more videos after this, like about Egypt or something. I don't know. I don't know if this video will even get any traction on YouTube, but we'll see about that. Now I'm tired. I think I wanna sleep. So, goodbye.